Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Today we are pleased to have Professor Giles Hooker from UPenn to to present in our June webinar. Giles is a professor of statistics and data science. His work has focused on statistical methods using dynamic system models, functional data analysis, and statistical aspects of fair and interpretable machine learning. He is author of two books, Dynamic Data Analysis, Modeling Data with Differential Equation and Functional Analysis in R and Matlab. Much of his work has been inspired by collaboration, particularly in ecology, human movement, and citizen science data. Giles is a prolific researcher. Since he has received a PhD from Stanford in 2004, he has published more than 100 high-quality papers, book chapters, and conference proceedings. He is also author and developer of a number of MATLAB and R softwares, including the well-known R library FDA, which is for functional data analysis, which I personally has used it before. Good job, Giles. Giles' research has been continuously funded by NSF, NIH, and also from private sectors, including an NVIDIA hardware grant. He is also serving or has served in a number of editorial board of many top journals and conferences, including JASA, Journal of Machine Learning Research, NeuroNIPS, JRSSB, and Electronic Journal of Statistics. Giles has also served as officer in many professional organizations, including American Society of Quality Control. He has been the treasurer secretary for statistical computing sector of American Statistical Science, and he has served as publication officer for SLDS sector. Being a colleague of Giles for many years in SLDS, I just want to say that it has been a great pleasure working with you. Okay, without further ado, let's welcome Giles. And Giles, please take over.
Many thanks to Hua. And actually, as a publications officer, we now actually have a link to our YouTube channel up on the main SLDS webpage too. So it's having actually posted links to these webinars. It's a great honor to actually to come and give one myself. This talk is an amalgam of a whole decade or so long research program into uncertainty quantification and inference using machine learning methods. And so owes a lot to a number of students and grad students who I've listed here. If you come across them, they are all fantastic. And as well as some excellent colleagues at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And I will show you some of the data that they've been generating. And that has motivated a lot of the sorts of methods that we've been developing. As Jill said, there's a couple of ways to sort of interrupt and ask questions. Please do. I like this to be dynamic if it can be. There are no stupid questions when the talk is being recorded as well as afterwards. And I've asked Jill to interrupt me if I am running on and haven't actually noted your question. Let me just see if I can get rid of, there we go. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is inferential questions in machine learning. How do I use all of the wonderful technology that, say, 25 years ago, Leo Breiman wrote about in this Two Cultures essay, and do all of the classic statistical, I want to put a confidence interval on that program that people like David Cox objected that Leo Breiman couldn't do. So in particular, I'm going to use Breiman's own random forests to do this as a particular structure that I can get hold of. We'll talk about the fairly classical mathematical framework that, in fact, this fits into fairly neatly. And we will use that for the sorts of things that the Lab of Ornithology was interested in doing. some of where this comes from, or where this talk comes from, is about then trying to explore doing that better. And we'll talk about that and possibly some things in boosting. As Joko mentioned, I've worked in a number of other areas. I think all academics kind of have research ADD, but it certainly applies to me. So functional data analysis, nonlinear dynamics in particular, and also I dabble in robust statistics. And if anybody has seen some of that and wants to talk to me about it, I'm very happy to offline or after the seminar is done. Okay, so for the purposes of this talk, by machine learning, I am going to mean a problem of, or methods that do high-dimensional non-parametric prediction. That's certainly not everything that is encompassed by the name. It doesn't include things like clustering, dimension reduction. It doesn't include generative models as well. But really, I think you can still make a pretty clear, a pretty reasonable claim that, in fact, the core of what you think of in terms of machine learning, random forests, support vector machines, if you're old enough, deep neural networks are effectively prediction engines, and they try to do so in a non-parametric way. And I don't need to tell people that this has been enormously successful over the past 30. That probably needs to be updated to 35 years at this point, because these methods infuse all of our daily lives super regularly. I was in an Uber driver a couple of months ago and asked him how he was going. He said, "Well, the algorithm is being good to me today." And that's, I think, a real indication of the extent to which both these have become daily lives, but also our awareness or public awareness of it. Now, part of the ways that they have been successful have been to, following Breiman, following Breiman's description of it, have been to avoid the sorts of structures that statisticians would normally think of, and certainly would have normally thought of 20 years ago. So they don't put linear structural assumptions or parametric assumptions on their models. They don't specifically try and do some sort of structural model selection. They have these algorithmic forms of trying to learn how to predict well. That is, and what that results in is algebraically complex prediction functions. So a deep neural network or a random forest is just a formula, but if you wrote it down, either one of them would take, several hundred pages if in typeset material. And what that does is it performs very well, but it provides little guidance as to what features are important or how you might understand what a black box is doing. And it also doesn't come with classical uncertainty quantification in the way that a statistician would use, and that's proved difficult to develop. Now, there have been some important advances in the last 5 to 10 years in the statistical community that I'm not going to talk about, but just to flag them. We've developed really useful techniques for doing prediction intervals. So saying, okay, I'm making a prediction, that's where I expect Y to be given these inputs, but I'd like an interval for how far off that Y might actually be. And there are a whole suite of techniques under the label of conformal inference that do that very well. There's also the causal inference community has also really jumped on the bag on using these, and things like double machine learning and targeted learning have become very successful within the causal inference literature. The specific problem that I am interested in doesn't fall into either of those. It's much more directly related to what you are doing to what machine learning is immediately doing. And that is to say that what I want is to say, if I've done some machine learning to produce a model F, and I'll specify some notation on the next slide, I want to say, look, if I got an independent data set and retrained that model, where might that data set, where might that model, that retrained model predict? So I want to give you a set that says, here is the range of predictions that you might have if you obtained a model independently of the one that you have. This is what I call a reproduction interval. I'm specifying it this way as opposed to in terms of some classical inferential quantity for reasons that will become apparent, but basically because this lets me be a little bit more agnostic about what my machine learning method is actually doing. Okay, a little bit of notation. I'm going to assume that we have a set of n observations, xi, yi. You might call these, if you're coming out of computer science, examples or realizations. Each xi is a vector of p covariates. So this is very much the statistical notation, but again, you could call them features or predictors or variables. And you're going to use that data set to estimate a prediction function f that takes in the entries for each of these covariates and spits out an estimate of what y is going to be. You can estimate it. You can say you learn it. I really hate the word learned, but I think we're kind of stuck with it. Or train it. This will be a little less relevant, but xi will be a row of the data set. Dot j will be a column. I'm going to use lowercase variables as to indicate just inputs or arguments to a function, and negative subscripts to say everything except, say the jth element of x. And what I want to do is have some way of understanding some of what f is doing, and to, in particular for this talk, assess the statistical stability of that understanding. So the particular machine learning method that I'm going to work with, although in some sense we'll see, it's a bit of a stretch. I'm going to not try and oversell this, but it's a bit of a stretch to say this applies to everything, but I'll give you the pitch later on. The particular machine learning method we're going to work with is tree-based ensembles. So decision trees were very early models. These don't need a lot of introduction these days, but we worked out fairly quickly that individual decision trees don't work very well. What you can do, though, extremely well, is to aggregate many of them. And so Leo Breiman, in fact, produced two versions of this. Initially, he just bagged decision trees. And for that, all he did was to take bootstrap samples of his data, build a tree on each bootstrap sample, and then when it comes time to make a prediction, you make predictions for each of these trees and you average them. Following that, in 2001, the random forests method came out. Very similar idea, just he actually fiddled with the internal structure of the tree building process. And so when he was building a tree, when you come up to decide how to structure an internal node, he would only allow himself to randomly select some set of the covariates and then choose amongst them in terms of making a selection. That's not going to be overly relevant. I'm going to try and abstract away mostly from the tree building process. But this has become one of the best off-the-shelf learning methods that there is, at least for tabular data. That is, random forests tend to give you a pretty good answer at very little human input or training or hyperparameter fine-tuning. There are hyperparameters. You can, in fact, tune them to improve things, but performance is relatively insensitive to these. And Breiman came up with fairly good, fairly general sort of defaults. These were of interest, and in fact, that property was of particular interest to my colleagues at Cornell's Lab of Ornithology. The project that I got involved in is called eBird. So ornithology, actually, as it turns out, has done citizen science for well over a century now. The Great Christmas Bird Count goes back into the 1890s, as was instigated, I think, from the Audubon Society. And this really follows that tradition. So in the early 2000s, once the internet started becoming a thing. The researchers at the lab developed this program that basically instituted a sort of all-the-time bird count. So effectively, if you are a bird watcher, you can give the lab data. Now, you pay the lab for the privilege of giving them data, which is a really neat trick. But you can you sign up for an account, you go out bird watching, and you come back and you log on and you say, okay, I went to the following GPS coordinates at the following time, and I saw the following numbers of each of these species, right? 2 cardinals, 1,000,005 sparrows, a bunch of Canada geese, etc. They also record, how long did I look? Did I walk and how far? Were there more people in my party? Now, the fact that you have a GPS and time coordinates allows you to add a bunch of GIS information about what the local landscape looks like, land use, land cover, how much water is there at certain spatial scales, and this is of interest to some of what the lab wants to know about in terms of at what scale does a bird perceive its environment. And they are starting to put in weather coordinates. Zhihua, I see you waving at me. And a couple of hands, or is that a couple of hands in the chat or in Q&A?
Yeah, there is a Q&A question. It's also my question. Isn't my phone?
Is this the Merlin app? I see.
Yeah.
So actually not quite. Merlin is a different product from the Lab-of-O. It's actually somewhat more recent. It's based on recognizing the audio of bird calls, by and large, which actually the Lab-of-O has been doing for a very, very long time. There are large internal disputes about the relative accuracy of eBird versus Merlin, and how they might be merged. And for good statistical reasons, right? There are real challenges in doing this. So eBird is in fact a separate program from that.
Got
Um, Currently is as of about 5 years ago. In fact, there were over 1.2 billion records. This is a wonderful example of Moore's law in data sizes. When I first started working with the Lab-of-O in 2006, they had about 6 million records, and we thought it was the largest hand-collected data set in the world. The exponential curve on that, is again one of these things. Because of all of the GIS coordinates, there are over 1,000 potential covariates that you can associate with each of these bird observations. Usually there's some tens is what gets employed in most of these analyses in practice. Now, what do they use this for? Well, they wanted to produce data-driven maps of where there are birds, right? Where species are, what their migration routes like. They wanted to look at these maps for hypotheses about bird ecology, and things like how do birds spatially perceive their environment. They wanted to track evidence of changing ecological factors, and they wanted to forecast bird migration. Now, they don't get to see the birds move. You do get some bird movement out of weather radar data, as it turns out, but they don't actually get to see the birds move here. So you're inferring that. And what they built was something that looked surprisingly like a random forest. It was basically built on random forests, but they insisted on localizing each tree to apply in sort of overlapping space-time blocks. And that forced some separation of the ecological variables, but basically otherwise it's the same framework. And they did this because they have some 700 species. And they needed something that could deal with large amounts of data and do pretty well without having to spend very much human time on making that work. Part of what they did this for was in fact a grant for the Lab of Ornithology. It initially, from the Audubon Society for their State of the Birds report about a decade ago, and they've continued to provide them with data since then. Initially, they worked just on the lower 48 states. You can see this is just a map of where we have observations. It's now a global program. But we'll focus, on North America for our particular problem. Just to show you the sort of product that they've produced, I'm going to briefly switch slides because if somebody can tell me how to embed a video in PDF, I will be very grateful. But for the moment, I just switched to PowerPoint to do this. So this is one of Cornell, the lab's products. This is a map of tree swallow migration through the year. So there's, I think, 52 frames here, one for each week. And technically what you see is the probability of seeing a tree swallow if you go out birding at 7 a.m. and look for an hour because they need to normalize the observation process as well. And this is a migratory species. There's a picture of one up here. They winter down around the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, as you can see here, and then they migrate up into the northern parts of the US, Canada, and Alaska, lighting up places like the Central Valley in California for their nesting season, and then migrate that down. You can see, say, the Mississippi Valley really light up on that on that return route for their winter migration. Now, if you told me that a random forest could give you this level of detail, I would have, I thought of these things as being fairly, unsubtle. I would have been rather surprised, but it's amazing what hundreds of millions of observations will do. Let me come back to the slides. Wherever I had them, there we go. So we generated these sorts of maps and a lot of other products as well in terms of looking at what habitat features appeared to be important for these birds. And so we get predictions for individual cases. We started trying to look at measures of structure. We'll talk a little bit about that. This was not part of what the lab has been interested in, but a lot of explainable artificial intelligence has been about trying to give you explanations for individual predictions. And the question that we want to ask about is, well, how much do we trust those results, right? So I would like confidence intervals for outputs, right, for the predictions, for summaries of models, and I'd like to test generated hypotheses. And I'd like to make this computationally feasible. So the story I tell is in about 2014, when we were generating this set of maps, we actually used the NSF's supercomputer facility called TerraGrid at the time. It doesn't exist anymore. And just trying to run the models for these maps promptly crashed it. There were some very unpleasant emails about that. So we're not going to be able to bootstrap this process. Whether or not the bootstrap is actually consistent for something like random forest is equally not true, is equally not clear, but I'd like to point out that the random forest already has a bootstrap structure going on in it. And so, we'd like to be able to use that if we possibly can. So how do I get there? I don't want to analyze the tree growing, the way you build trees. And in fact, that hasn't gotten very far. Most of the theoretical results we have are getting closer, but it's sort of inching, and a lot of them make simplifying assumptions about the tree building process that doesn't exactly correspond to how they're done, say, in random forests. Whether that's important is a separate question. There are sometimes good reasons to think that it might be better to do something that's slightly different. And that will include a little bit of my own tweak that we'll get to here. So what I'm going to need to do is rely on the structure of having this ensemble. Now, the problem is I'm not interested in an individual tree, so bootstrapping, even if it was consistent for trees, and I think there's good reasons to think of what bootstrapping a tree wouldn't be, doesn't get me what I want. I want an interval for the average of a whole bunch of bootstraps. And you could say, okay, well, it's an average. We've got some ways to try and deal with averages. They're things that statisticians like. But bootstrapping means that those trees are pretty highly correlated. In fact, because I'm doing bootstraps, if I take any two trees, the proportion of data that gets put into each of those trees is lower bounded by sort of about 30%. So you've always got any pair of trees, you're going to expect to have 30% data overlap. So you're not going to be able to get rid of correlation that way. And this led us to say, well, you know what? We could start getting rid of correlation simply by, rather than bootstrapping, taking subsamples. And so as long as we take subsamples of the data rather than bootstrap, then you can expect that the data going into the individual trees will start to produce less and less overlap. And we thought, okay, this is maybe somewhere we can go with this. And so I'm going to build a tree. I think I've got this here. I'm going to build trees based on subsamples. So that's the sole tweak that I'm going to make to Bryman's random forest algorithm. If you do perform, does it matter? If you do performance analyses, you mostly want pretty large subsamples. It's usually not actually full bootstrap. Depends. Okay, so now I'm going to think about what am I doing? Well, I'm going to look at these subsamples, and I'm going to say if I take a subsample, I'm going to build a tree and make a prediction at some point X star. And so that's going to be something that I'm going to think of as a function of the subsample. I'm obviously not going to rebuild my ensemble every time that I want to make a new prediction, but this is a useful way of conceptualizing how to get uncertainty quantification. And once you start looking at that, this starts looking like a very classical and very well-studied set of estimators called U-statistics. And U-statistics come up, in fact, in a general form that says, hey, if I've got some estimator that requires k observations and specific to k observations, but I actually have n, what should I do? Well, there is an optimal thing to do, is to say choose all possible subsamples that of size k subsamples of the n that you have, get the estimate out of that and average those. Now, the nice thing about U-statistics is going all the way back to 1948, we have a central limit theorem for them. That is, supposing I have IID data, I have some function, calling it permutation symmetric isn't particularly important because it doesn't really matter as long as I'm taking every possible permutation of the x's. Then this U-statistic, as long as it's got a second moment, is also asymptotically normal. And it's asymptotically normal with a variance term that we can estimate or that we can start to understand. And I'll get to that in a few slides. Now, we needed to do a few things to apply all of this. First of all, the classical U-statistic central limit theorem, and if you look it up in any of the classical textbooks, holds only for fixed k. So that is, it assumes that I put the same size subsample through my estimator, in this case through my tree, even as n grows. That's not going to be realistic for something like random forests. If we've got more data, we want to give trees more data, build more trees, have less bias in our estimate. So that's not reasonable. The extension to this are called infinite order U-statistics. They were studied by Edward Fries for a few papers. There wasn't actually very much in there. Computationally, I'm not going to build all n choose k trees, certainly not when n is in the millions. So for even moderate sized data sets, we're going to have to choose subsets at random, and that's exactly what is done in random forests. And algorithmically, random forests use additional randomization. Within the tree building process, there are independent random numbers that are used to, say, choose which features are going to be examined for potential splits. So the kernels that we're using, so this estimator, which in your U statistic framework is called a kernel, is non-deterministic. Now, all of this, however, basically amounts to adding epicycles onto a great big mathematical crank. And Lucas Mensch and I worked through this. Lucas and some of his students then did it distinctly better a few years later. And so the fundamental theorem that all of this is based on is this, which is to say, okay, if you have an ensemble of learners, so T is something that takes in data sets and a random number and spits out a prediction, and you build these learners using subsamples of size Kn, so n can grow with, so the subsample size can grow with n. And you define a couple of variance components, which we'll come back to later. There's a limit, there's a ratio condition that is not crazy by and large under reasonable sort of expectations. You'd say this is something like the subsample size is little o of n. So we can't grow proportionally. It has to get a little bit smaller than that, but only little o. You can get pretty close to n. Then this ensemble has a central limit theorem centered around its expectation, which when you divide by this particular variance gives you a nice normal distribution. And again, we'll talk about this variance. That's the sort of the core part of the rest of the talk. Centering this on an expectation is not quite inference. And this is part of the reason why I talked about having reproduction intervals. Where might an independent copy of F end up being? That's because I have not wanted to talk about what this tree building process does. I've tried to be agnostic about what your weak learner looks like. There's some nice results. Stefan Weger and Susan Athey came along, followed our work out fairly quickly, where they could replace this expectation with some sort of inferential quantity, like the expected value of y given x. To do that, they had to be specific and do some specific analysis about exactly what their tree does. And again, it's not exactly what random forests do. You can argue whether or not that's a good thing. As a quite legitimate argument, there's trade-offs that I don't think have been very deeply analyzed. But you had to be really specific. You do have to be really specific because it's actually about what does your bias look like, which isn't about the sort of just the basic ensemble structure that I'm talking about here. Early results for this look good. These were a couple of ways that we had of trying to estimate the variance that gave us basically the same answer. This is for an eBird problem. This was somebody going birding in sapsucker woods in Ithaca, sort of through the year. And you can see, and now this is I think abundance is actually wrong. I think this is just the probability of occurring, but you can see a sort of binomial-like uncertainty quantification as you get larger variables. This is, I think, built only on tens of thousands of data points, but even so, that's like fairly wide for the sorts of things that you'd expect. There's more uncertainty than you would think in these sorts of models, precisely because they're designed to try and capture any signal that might be out there. The sorts of things that we were interested in doing with the lab was to ask questions about whether some of the inputs mattered. And so again, this is fairly early work. A couple of things that you might think about doing. The first thing we thought about doing was just to say, well, what if we sort of took some features and then said, let's test whether others add anything. This is effectively what Larry Wasserman would call the leave one covariate out test, or leave some covariates out test if there's a block of them. And so we could build a tree with build a forest with those covariates and without. And if we were careful about how we built them, then we could just say, oh, look, we could just look at the difference in those forests. And that's itself a U statistic. If we evaluated these at a set of points, we could have a multivariate central limit theorem that follows pretty immediately, and try and assess whether this difference is actually, the expectation of this difference is actually different from zero. I put that up there because it doesn't work. And in fact, Lucas went on to do some really interesting work on LOCO to show that LOCO will actually pick up on having additional noise variables, and adding additional noise variables can make your random forest better. In this case, the behavior of the trees actually, despite trees being thought of as being fairly robust to having a source, noise features, the behavior of trees is affected by their presence, and you can detect that. You can pull that. You can pick that out. What we did find was that if I replaced these data sets, if I didn't just give it a lower dimensional data set, I just replaced this augmented data set, these augmented feature variables, with something that was noise. So in our case, we just permuted the values of XA in our data set. Then we didn't seem to have this problem. So it was about dimensionality. And we could run exactly these sorts of tests. But we did recommend sort of checking that if you sort of permute features twice, you could tell the difference. And here's just a version of this. This was a different bird, indigo bunting, another small songbird. We just test whether there was changes in abundance over year, which looked like there was, but if I randomized the value of year that I was giving the random forest, it also detected changes in abundance, which wasn't great. You don't see any changes between two randomizations of year, though, so we're fairly happy in terms of saying, well, this process of replacing features with noise and asking, does that change things, was fairly robust. A more realistic problem, here we were interested in assessing the effect of maximum temperature on the timing of full migration. This is still, I think this is tree swallow again, which is an insectivore. And the thought was if it stays warmer during the fall, then the tree swallows, the insects are still around. Tree swallows will be more likely to stick around eating them, and then they will migrate later. And what we did was we just looked at abundance and the timing of abundance through the fall at a bunch of different bird sanctuaries down the East Coast. And, at this point, then we could give you maps about whether or not you were running, how important that maximum temperature. Actually, we had to look at this is daily maximum temperature, and we had to orthogonalize it relative to the average daily maximum. We could give you maps about how important those were and whether they tended to make your abundance greater or smaller through the day, through the year. Okay, so to do all of that, we need some way of estimating what the variance in this random forest actually is. And there's been a bit of a history on how to do this. Very early version of this came from Sexton and Larkey, who adopted what they didn't call, but both Stefan Weger and I came up with independently as the title of a bootstrap of little bags. Effectively, they built small random forests on bootstraps. And then they said, well, the variance between those random forests is going to be an upper bound for the variance of all of their average, and in fact, you can get a bit of a correction for that as well. There was some work by Wang and Lindsay on variance estimation for U statistics if you just look at samples that are completely disjoint. And Stefan had come up in quite early on this paper using the infinitesimal jackknife for it, where the infinitesimal jackknife says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my tree, the prediction for my tree, and for each data point or the predictions across all of my trees, and I'm going to look at the covariance of whether or not that tree got to use data point I for each data point. And I'm going to square those covariances and sum them up. And I'll talk a little bit about the infinitesimal jackknife and where it comes from in just a tick. But if you come back to looking at the U statistics problem, the variance that we had was actually given this way. This looks kind of awful. But what it is it says you take your tree, you take the expected value over everything except the first observation. And then you take the variance of that expected value. So the variance is over the first observation you give the tree. And this looks very much like the variance of a conditional expectation. And there's a whole literature on estimating the variance of a conditional expectation as well. We did something that looked very naive. We, meaning Lucas Mensch and I, did something that looked very naive nearly 10 years ago, where we just implemented this directly. We said, let's fix an x1, build many trees where that is where that particular data point is the first thing in my subsample, average those trees, then take those a variance of those averages. We'll talk about that in a minute. It doesn't work very well unless you take build many more trees than is done in practice. Zhengzi Zhou then came out with a very nice alternative of this, because I said there's got to be a connection to infinitesimal jackknife here. And he said, well, rather than trying to put extra structure into how you're building your ensemble, build your ensemble. Then what you can do is you say, well, look, I'm going to look at, for each data point, I'm going to look at all of the trees that use that data point, and I'm going to average their values. And then I'm going to look at the variance amongst those now n averages. So I don't have to do any more structuring. This is exactly coming back into using this. Later on, this n is not going to be did tree B, did subsample B include data point I? It's actually going to be how many times, because I will come back to something a little closer to bootstrapping. And in special cases, then you can show that this, what Zhengzi called a balanced method, gives you effectively, or the way you would plug in that balanced method into your U statistics variance, gives you effectively exactly the infinitesimal jackknife estimate. What this does do is get us a sense about where some of these variance estimates are going wrong, which I'll talk about. The problem is, yes, Johar.
A question from the audience: for using the U stats, do all the subsets need to be disjoint, in which case the data set must be quite big?
Yeah, thank you. Good point. No, they don't. If you have disjoint data sets, then all of your trees are independent. And your central limit theorem can be applied really naively, right? You know, you do exactly what you would normally do. That's going to require, you observe really huge data sets and relatively small data sets going into each tree. And so what we want to do is get something closer where the size of those subsets can be close to proportional to n. It still has to shrink, you know, more fast, you know, relative to n faster than that, but it can be very close to proportional to it. Um, so the problem that we have here is, in fact, we needed to build huge forests to get reasonable uncertainty quantification. And the reason we needed to do that is that the variance is that this M, so the average of trees that include MI, the average of trees that got to see observation I, is itself a Monte Carlo estimate, because I'm not looking at all of the possible subsamples. And that Monte Carlo estimate, when I then take a variance, gets added to the variance I'm estimating. And the practical effect of this is rather large. So on a log scale, here are variance estimates from both what Lucas and I originally did, from the infinitesimal jackknife, and from Jung's new method, balanced method, um, at various different ensemble sizes. So at 100 trees, now nobody builds 100 ensembles of 100 trees. This is log difference, and the red line here is actually the truth. At 100 trees, we are orders of magnitude too large. We are even, an order of magnitude or two too large in using 1,000 trees, which is around the default that gets implemented in something like Ranger. It's what you need to perform pretty well. More than that, you're not really doing it for trees. You need to get up to 10,000 trees, and even then you're a bit big. We ended up with ensembles of 100,000 trees at one point. So you could say, well, yeah, sure, but I know that this is associated with the bias of this Monte Carlo estimate, like the variance of this Monte Carlo estimate. I can add that and I can subtract the bias. What's the problem? And in fact, both Stefan and I tried this. And if you do this, you get negative estimates pretty quickly. You really underestimate. You overcorrect very quickly. And in fact, it was pretty common to say, oh, well, actually, I'm having this negative estimate of the variance. That's not super helpful. Stefan ended up using a very ad hoc empirical based approach to deal with this. The problem with this is that if I just look at the variance between these trees, they're built on subsamples that are taken without replacement. And that means that those trees are negatively correlated. I know that if I've got two subsamples, they're more overlapping than just dealing with them individually. There's another bias correction that also doesn't work in the Ranger package that's based on an approximation, that's based on an independence assumption. That's also problematic. I haven't checked in the last year or so if that's been fixed. I need to. So yeah, we have this breakdown that's associated with particularly as the size of the subsample gets large. And we were wondering about this because that's odd. I know how to estimate the variance of Monte Carlo simulation. I know how to do so unbiasedly. What's going on? And the problem is this subsampling approach, negative correlation. And Jungsa said, well, we could fix this. What if we just did this as simulating from the empirical distribution? And that would correspond to taking subsamples, but doing so with replacement. And in fact, when we do that, this works really pretty nicely. And it's one of these surprising things of really flipping that flag to replace equals true fixes everything up, but it does. Now, this does now say this is exact for simulating from the empirical distribution in terms of doing variance estimates, but if you assume that your empirical distribution converges, etc., and I haven't seen that convergence and I haven't done that analysis specifically, then this is going to be consistent. And so effectively, we have a set of models which come out to looking very much like what you would do in a random effects model to estimate this zeta. And I'm focusing on this zeta 1. There's another zeta there that's the between trees variance. That's much easier to work with because that's just about not having enough trees in your ensemble. And it turns out that even though we build many, many fewer trees than you would think might make this vanish asymptotically, this zeta 1 term is in fact the thing that is by far and away dominates the variance. Okay, so yes, Zhihua, another question?
Yeah, from audience Thomas. Wager et al. Focused on the notion of honest trees. Does sampling with replacement preserve this property? And this refers to slide 25.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. That is an interesting question. Um, you would have to do some additional work to preserve what honesty looks like. So for context, honesty is the notion of saying, well, you take your subsample, you then split that in two, and you use part of the subsample to decide the structure of your trees, and the other part of the subsample to actually give you the values in the leaves. And this prevents you what I describe as chasing order statistics, right? So you know that I haven't like isolated some really large value, and then my tree is like really biased in that particular leaf. Um, and so Stefan gets around this by this approach, and again, you can argue that that might just be a mathematical device. He's got some reasonable arguments to say that it can actually improve your performance. There's a trade-off. This is one of these cases where it's not clear that making that change is good or bad, and I don't actually don't have something to say about that. If I subsampled with replacement, I would need to be careful about how I then divided that subsample up to preserve honesty, right? But it would be possible. From my point of view, I'm not trying to do honest trees because I'm not like the how to deal with bias and the consistency of trees is super important, but that's not the thing I'm focusing on here. We run into a problem. I've just changed my sampling routine. I'm no longer working in U statistics. Instead, what I've got is what's called a V statistic, which is just, okay, this is the average of all subsamples taken with replacement rather than without replacement. And if you look at all of the classical texts, they'll say, well, who cares? Because asymptotically, these are the same. That only holds in the classical setting. If you have infinite order V statistics, well, there's a paper by Shi and Edward Fries, who studied infinite order V statistics when you grow like n to the quarter. But that's basically it. N to the quarter is far too slow for us. Our initial estimates, our initial results were confined to n equal to it looks like something glitched in the network, but let me share my screen again, and hopefully I'm back online. Are we working? Hello? Okay, I see
Yeah,
Chihua.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, so it turns out you don't need to.
We have a raised hand. Like, do we have a
Oh yeah,
question in the audience?
yeah.
Let's see.
I think that might have been in error.
Okay.
Um, you don't have to do any of the accounting to construct this kernel. It turns out that doing exactly the same things that we've been doing gives you the correct variance estimate. And this is now something that works you know, um, pretty well. That's fairly good at about 1,000 bootstraps. It's still a little bit conservative um, relative to sort of where you asymptote. Uh, but it's fairly, it's basically on the money at the size of random forests that you would normally build. Does it hurt performance? Answer is not really. The one thing that doing subsampling with replacement does is to make you somewhat less sensitive to the size of the subsample that you choose. Basically, because you end up averaging over effectively a lot more subsamples. I know we're running close to time. I will sort of declare that our coverage looks good. We actually did this by breaking up a very large data set into small ones and asking about, did I cover where other, independent replicates ended up producing predictions, which was fairly nice. A little bit of an extension of that, we looked at the infinitesimal jackknife because it's a super useful general form. Effectively, what you do is you say, let me look at the derivative of an estimate that I'm making with respect to upweighting an individual data point, and then take the sum of squares of those derivatives. And that also lets you look at covariances. And so this allowed us to do things like add forests together, because you would need to then account for the covariance of those two forests, or add a forest on top of some other estimator as well. So an M estimator is standing in as just some generic parametric regression model. We did that partly because actually boosting forests, so build one forest, take residuals, build a forest to predict those residuals, add them together, almost always improves performance. Almost always improves predictive performance. We said that seems like a sensible thing to do then. Can we produce variance estimates? And well, yes, you can, because you can now estimate the covariance between any two models. And so here we've got both reproduction frequency across a number of combinations of models. And then because I have got covariances between models, I could also compare the predictions that they make. And so here I've given you confidence intervals for a particular prediction that I'm using, and done the classic thing amongst a bunch of different potential models of saying, oh, look, these are not statistically distinguishable, but I could tell the difference between this group of things and this set of models because they're making actually statistically different different predictions. Little note here, I've talked about only the ensembling structure. So where I've got XGB here, that's actually a boosted machine that I've then ensembled by taking subsamples with replacement and building an XGBoost model on each of those. So the little sort of pitch here is to say, well, if you were going to bootstrap, why not just do an ensemble and use this? Now you do need order 1,000, which means that if you were going to just bootstrap to get a variance, that might be large. But here you get to use all of your models both to predict and to get variance as well. That does raise some work that I think I'm going to end up declaring myself out of time for. I'm sure Johal would be pleased to see me do that. On trying to run. Yes, Johal?
By the way, we started like 5 minutes late. You can
Oh,
keep going.
okay.
But there is a quick question from the audience, from Vladimir. Is there a software implementing your method?
Um, there isn't at the moment. I do need to tap the guys who produce Ranger to fix up their bias correction for their variance estimate and say, here's something better. And I think that's probably the best thing to do. So we asked about, can I do something equivalent for boosting? And we boosted random forests, but what about generic boosting without having to create a ensemble of boosted models. And, yes, you can do that if I was going to go so far as to do a non-parametric bootstrap, and therefore I'm creating order 1,000 models, I'd say just produce the ensemble. But, hey, boosting by itself does pretty well. That's a lot of extra work. We changed this a little bit more. What we did was, rather than just adding trees together, built on, so boosting says, okay, you've got your current ensemble, take residuals, build a tree to predict those residuals, and add it to the current ensemble. Often you have some sort of discount rate. We set up a running average. And the running average means that I get to, first of all, forget about early trees, which otherwise would be highly influential in what I get. And secondly, I get something that starts looking like a random forest again. Now, we haven't gotten as far as we'd like with that. It actually turns out that we can get something that looks like kernel ridge regression and gives us a nice central limit theorem, but it's not quite where we'd want. Recent work that's just been submitted with my new students, Haimo Fan and Kevin Tan, added some extra bells and whistles to this to get us closer to the sorts of things we'd like to do. It does produce fairly good uncertainty quantification, but there's still more theoretical work to make this work. Part of the reason I was interested in that is boosting lets me start doing things like structured models, additive models. So Rich Caruana's explainable boosting machines come into this framework. They produce an additive model. If you look at the mboost package, it can do things like partially linear models. And in fact, my student Ichan Zhou said, look, all of this actually comes under the framework of varying coefficient models, and proceeded to use boosting and this framework to produce a nice varying coefficient model for the Beijing housing price data set, where you have now coefficients for a number of terms that vary over space in Beijing. And for those of you familiar with Beijing, there's a expensive urban core that's also fairly old and so fairly low, with high-rise suburbs around it. And you can see some of the importance of, how important is your, being high up in the high rise, or whether or not you've renovated, changing depending on the structure of those neighborhoods. So that's been a lot. There's a lot of other work within this framework to do. I spent a lot of time talking about the statistical stability and the adequacy of model interpretation, otherwise under the framework of what nowadays gets called explainable artificial intelligence. That's sometimes talking about distilling models into interpretable models. Some of it's about variable importance measures. There's a bunch of interesting work on additive models. There's a bunch of interesting work on using the same sorts of frameworks to assess fairness. But all of this is to say we are getting the tools to really start talking about statistical forms of uncertainty quantification for machine learning methods. So 25 years after Breiman, I think we can say that disjunction isn't really there. But I think this is one of these beautiful examples of the theoretical details actually matter, and they make a difference in practice. And so actually doing the math can be important. Also, there's lots of work to do. One of the obvious places is in trying to do deep learning. We attempted to use the infinitesimal jackknife for it without a whole lot of success, for, I think, reasonable reasons. There's lots of things that go into that, and lots of interesting work in statistics being done, but still a lot to do. And I'll stop there. Thank you all for listening.